So how do we make sure that this validation logic does get executed? Well, for that, we need to tell Flutter that for this form, it should execute all the validators that are registered for all the form fields. And doing so is thankfully quite straightforward because you can get access to this form widget and the underlying object that's managed by Flutter, and you can tell Flutter to validate this form. Now you do get this access to form through a key. And that might be strange because we have used keys before in this course, but only to uniquely identify widgets, typically when used in a list. Now here it's the same key parameter, but it'll be a different kind of key that we add here. It'll be a key that we should create as a property here, and I'll name it form key, and it will be of type global key. So here I create a new global key by using the global key constructor function, the global key class, which is built into Flutter. And global key creates a, guess what, global key object that can be used as a value for a key, as we need it here. Now the difference between a global key and, for example, a value key, which we used before in this course, is that a global key here then also gives us easy access to the underlying widget to which it is connected, and it ensures that if that build method here is executed again, because we set some state, for example, this form widget is not rebuilt and instead keeps its internal state, which is very important because it's that internal state with which will work in the end. It's, for example, that internal state that will tell Flutter whether to show some validation errors on the screen or not. That's why such a global key should be created, and in general, when working with Flutter, you will almost always only need a global key for working with forms, because you can then also use this global key to get access to that form. And that is indeed what we'll do next. Before doing that though, I'll add a little state annotation here, because global key is actually a generic type. And I want to tell Flutter that the widget or the object to which this global key in the end will be connected will be a form state object. That's in the end what this form widget gives us under the hood. And this will simply give us some extra type checking and auto-completion suggestions. So we want to add this annotation here. With that added, I'll add a new method. SaveItem sounds like a fitting name. And it's this method that should be triggered once this last button here is pressed. So here, instead of pointing at an anonymous function, I'll point at SaveItem like this, not executing it, just pointing at it, so that this function gets executed when this button is pressed. And it's now in this function where I want to trigger validation. And doing so is super straightforward, because with that global key added and connected to the form, you can use it to access the current state property on that form key object and tell Dart that this will never be null. So in the end, you're telling Dart that your form key has been connected to the form. And here we know that SaveItem can't execute before this build method has been called, and therefore this form has been created and the form key attached. Because the only way of executing SaveItem is by pressing this button. That's the only place where we mention SaveItem. And at the point of time this button can be pressed, the form will of course have been created and the form key will of course have been attached to the form. So therefore in here we know with certainty that this underlying form state object will exist, and that's exactly what we're telling Dart here with that exclamation mark, that this underlying state object will exist and is not null. And then on this state object, we can access various utility methods, like for example, validate, which is a method provided by the form widget in the end, which will automatically, behind the scenes, reach out to all the form field widgets inside of the form, like text form field, and execute its validator functions. That's what validate will do. In addition, validate will return a Boolean value, which will be true if all validator functions passed, or false if at least one validator function failed. And this will become important later. With this added though, we can save everything, reload, and go back. And if I now click add item, I get an error here for the name because it's empty. If I enter an invalid quantity like -1, I also get an error there. By the way, speaking of the quantity, I just see that we should change the keyboard type here, so I will quickly do that. Go to the quantity and set the keyboard type here to text input type number. This is of course not related to validation, but something we should do. But detached from that, we now also got working validation. If I do submit valid values, those validation errors of course go away. And that's how we can leverage this form widget combined with this form global key here to automatically trigger all these validation functions which might return error messages which are displayed automatically by Flutter. And that of course makes form validation much easier than if you have to handle this manually. So we learned how we can use the form key to validate the input. We'll soon also use it to save the input and get access to the entered data. But before we do that, we can also use this form key and the form state to which we get access through that key to reset the form. And that's what I want to do here on this first button. We could also create a standalone method here or do it in this anonymous function here, which is what I'll do. And in there, we can also use this form key again and its current state, which we know won't be null, to then call the built-in reset method, which is provided by Flutter on this form state object to which this form key in the end is connected. And this will reset all input values. So with that, if we do that and we reload again, if I enter some values here and I then click reset, you see these input fields are set back to their initial values. And this can of course also be a super useful feature.